I think we're back on, William.
Great, okay, thank you. It's a real pleasure.
Apparently, only one of us can speak at any one moment in time.
Okay, I understand.
Can we agree to listen respectfully to each other?
I think the answer to that is yes.
And if I ask you a question, will you answer it?
With pleasure.
Great, excellent. It's lovely to see you again.
Yeah, it's my real pleasure, a real privilege to be able to participate in this historic conversation with you as Scotland prepares for the referendum.
Thank you, and thank you so much for making time available to be with us this evening. It is more than 5 years since we last spoke face to face, more than 5 years since you were last here with us in Scotland, and on that occasion I had the privilege of introducing you in the Hub in Edinburgh, where we had a masterclass, and for me, and you may remember this, it was an extraordinary moment to be able to introduce in the flesh William Ury to Edinburgh. So although you're not in the flesh as such here, you are with us and we can see you and you're on a very large screen. So we're looking forward very much to the conversation that we're going to have. Can I ask you first of all, William, what do you remember about your last visit to Edinburgh, just in general terms, and about the sense of things? Because at that point, I remember you were interviewed by the Times. You did a short interview and you were looking ahead to the possibility of there being a referendum on independence. Here we are in Scotland with only 14 days to go until that momentous vote occurs. We've had a full day today of fascinating conversations, discussions about the issues, about the concerns, the hopes and the fears, and it's been rich. And I just wonder if, looking back over those 5 years, and 5 years ago, you would give us your memories and recollections of how it was to be in Scotland at that time.
Well, it was a fabulous visit. I remember Edinburgh and Scotland being very vibrant and exciting, and it took me a chance to visit the Scottish Parliament, gave a little talk there, as you recall, and I remember this issue of independence was very much in the air as a possibility, and the question to me, which remains the question, is, can we deal with this all-important question in a collaborative way by looking for what are the real needs and interests of each side, or are we just doomed to resolve it in a wholly adversarial, winner-takes-all manner? And I think that question is still up. I think there's a huge choice for Scotland in 2 weeks. It's 2 weeks from today, is that right? And to me, perhaps there's an even bigger choice the day after, which is September 19th, which is whether or not, because after September 19th, that's when the negotiation begins. That's when the process of getting to yes begins, getting to yes both within Scotland, because you'll have half the society voting one way and half the society voting the other, whatever the outcome. And then you'll have a process of getting to yes with your neighbors in the United Kingdom, as well as in Europe.
Let's roll back a little bit and just reflect on the general principles of getting to yes and also getting past no and the power of a positive no and the third side. But before that, can I ask you about your journey to yes? How it is that you got involved in this and how you made the breakthroughs that led to you co-authoring Getting to Yes and then becoming such a significant figure in this transformation, or this transition to transformation from the positional bargaining norm of the past to interest-based collaborative problem solving. So before we get back into Scotland, William, just a little bit of your story and the discoveries that have led you to where you are.
Yeah, I had the great pleasure of meeting Roger Fisher when I was in graduate school, getting my PhD in anthropology. And I was interested, because to me this is a human problem, of how do we human beings in this era right now, at this moment in human evolution, how do we learn to deal with our differences? Because it seems to me that we're living in an age that future anthropologists might look back and say, this is the age of the human family reunion. Thanks to the communications revolution, of which our conversation right now is a good example, thanks to the knowledge revolution, all the tribes, all the different language groups, all the different tribes on Earth, and anthropologists might say there are about 15,000 of them, are now for the first time, we're in touch with each other. And it's like a big family reunion. And like many family reunions, it's not all peace and light. There are a lot of resentments, there are a lot of historic grievances, there are a lot of animosities and inequities and injustices. And to me, this challenge is how are we going to be able to deal with our differences in a good way, in a collaborative way, instead of in a violent way. And to me, that was the question I was asking myself back then, and what led me to Roger Fisher, and he and I started collaborating on this issue and looking at whether or not you could take the same practical ingenuity that we apply to better products like computers and video conference systems, can we apply that to the ways in which human beings reach agreement? And we studied that. Roger had a long and distinguished history as a professor of international law and had been involved in international negotiations. And we interviewed a great many diplomats and practitioners, and we tried to evolve a basic, I would say, common sense way of trying to imagine that what is the best advice you could give two people or two parties or two countries if they're involved in a dispute? What dance steps can they go through that can lead them in a good direction that's good for both sides, rather than in a negative direction that's bad for both sides?
How well do you feel that the principles of getting to yes have been adopted in the context of global and diplomatic negotiations over the years?
Well, in one sense, very well. I mean, that book, which Roger and I had no idea at the time, but that book went on to become a kind of classic that was widely taught in law schools, business schools, universities, corporations, NGOs, international organizations, and sold, millions and millions and millions of copies in almost every language on the planet. So the ideas have diffused. It became a kind of it kind of crystallized maybe a change in humanity from realizing that, okay, negotiation, first of all, isn't just something that is rarefied, that a few people do when they're, international diplomacy or when they're settling a labor strike, but it's actually something that we all do all the time, from the moment we get up in the morning to the moment we go to bed at night, in the sense that we engage in back and forth communication, trying to reach agreement with others, be it our families, our spouses, our children, or be it our colleagues, our co-workers, our bosses, and so on. And it's something that we engage in. When I ask audiences, inevitably people say, well, that's about 50% of my time I'm engaged in this process that we think of as negotiation. And to me, we're living in an era that I think we might entitle the negotiation revolution, because maybe a couple of generations ago, or a generation ago, the principal form for human beings making decisions was very much like a pyramid. The people on the top of the pyramids of power, whether it's in business or in politics, they made the decisions, and the people on the bottom follow the decisions. And nowadays, what we're seeing is that thanks to the knowledge revolution, people are not content to have people at the top of the pyramids of power make decisions for them anymore. And organizations are increasingly flattening, resembling networks of negotiation, so that negotiation, in other words, horizontal decision-making, shared decision-making, is becoming the norm. And to me, what's happening in Scotland today is just an example of this historic process of people saying, we want to participate more, we want more say in decisions that affect us, and how are we going to do this together? And we're living in a world that's increasingly interdependent, and so the question is, how do we do that together with others? And so we can all learn. We can all learn from Scotland, just like Scotland could perhaps learn from other places in the world.
Let's pick up on that particular point, because one might say that, and yet for all that you have said, there are so many examples around the world of the pyramid structure which you described, the power-based, coercive approach to decision-making. And certainly in our referendum campaigns here, we've seen how polarizing this can become, particularly with the binary question with which we're being presented. But you talk about learning from other countries. Do you have examples, William, of other countries where there have been, if not identical situations to that which we face in the UK and with Scotland, but where there have been transitions, significant changes, where the getting to yes principles have been applied and where they've been applied to good effect?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, first of all, let me just say, I mean, in the last, 30, 35 years, I've had the privilege of having a kind of a front seat on this revolution that I call the negotiation revolution. And it's taken me to many different countries around the world. And particularly my passion has been around, trying to help countries avoid, prevent, or end wars. And right now, just if I think about other countries which have faced the same kind of dilemma that I've been involved in, many of them have tried to resolve this particular issue through war. I worked in Aceh, Indonesia. I worked in former Yugoslavia. I worked in the former Soviet Union, where a lot of these issues around independence and what's the right relationship between the part and the whole, and so on, were resolved with tens of thousands of deaths sometimes. And so, to me, I think, as adversarial sometimes as the atmosphere may seem sometimes, as heated as the debate gets, for example, in Scotland right now, I think it's important to pull back to the balcony for a moment and get some perspective and say that you have the great fortune of being able to deal with an issue that in prior centuries, prior generations, might have led to war, or there would have been talk of war, but that's totally unthinkable now. So to me, it's a huge luxury, and what's happening in Scotland is a function of huge changes that have taken place in Europe since the Second World War, where an instrument for resolving disputes, war, is now being fairly well ruled out. In terms of the latter part of your question, one country that comes to mind, it wasn't a question of independence so on, but was South Africa. And I know that you're an admirer of Nelson Mandela, for example, but he and his colleagues, read Getting to Yes, received that kind of instruction, and so did de Klerk and his negotiators. And I think there was a realization there, as Mandela put it, at first, the general thinking that people brought. He said, I remember hearing him talk about this together with de Klerk, and they were reflecting that at first they thought, okay, we'll try, we're gonna use violence. There was a lot of violence between the two sides. And then they thought, okay, we'll use negotiation, but they thought of it largely as in win-lose terms. They were just gonna try to win at the table, but they couldn't win on the battlefield. And then gradually, there was an appreciation that, in fact, there was a way for both sides to win, for all sides to win. And that was the kind of the thinking of Getting to Yes. And they realized that actually the only way that South Africa could actually make it through this very difficult political transition, and I was in South Africa just before Mandela was released and just after he became president. So I saw, like in 5 or 6 years, an incredible, astonishing transformation in South Africa. When I was there in 1989, I was the guest, actually, of the British ambassador. And I remember asking him over dinner, we had a dinner together, and I said, Robin, how long do you think this is going to take, this transition? And he said, oh, it'll be at least 30 years. And so even the most experienced, and he was a very experienced, skilled observer and negotiator who was very much in touch with all sides, we're way off in terms of how fast a political transition could take place if the presumption was we have to find a way that all sides can benefit. And Mandela made it very clear he was fighting for the freedom not just of the whites but of the blacks as well.
Let me just pick up on that. I mean, you rightly observe that it's most unlikely that our situation here will be resolved or descend into physical violence, certainly of the war sort. And yet there is another kind of violence which is not physical, but which results in polarization, antagonism, unwillingness to discuss, the putting up of barriers and impediments. From what you described, going back to South Africa, and it's quite important perhaps to persevere with that example, both the de Klerk government and Mandela and his team had been tutored in or had become skilled in the principles of getting to yes, and we'll talk more about what these are specifically in due course. I mean, do you think that it's necessary for both sides to have an understanding of what it takes to be able to follow what you describe as an interest-based approach to negotiation, to bring about this expeditious resolution or addressing of difficult issues?
You know, I think there's a learning process, John, that takes place. Because I think our mentality, our collective mentality still is very much influenced by what you might call win-lose or adversarial thinking. When there's a conflict, you know, we can do win-win when, you know, we're all on the same, you know, family or something like that. You know, we can imagine that with friends and family. But with people with whom we start to take the opposite side of an issue, it very quickly can descend into adversarial kind of thinking. And I had the pleasure of watching the debate, or actually the other night, and you know, there was a lot of that kind of adversarial thinking, as if, you know, it's only one side can win. And it's true that in a strict sense, you know, on September 14th, or September 18th, September 18th, you know, there's going to be a win or a loss for one side or the other. But to me, the great illusion that would be that's the last round. That's only the opening round in a long process. Because to me, the process has to be, okay, within Scotland, what do we do the day after? Because at that point, you know, half the population will have been on one side, half the population will be on the other. Those who, to me, as I listen at least to the debate, what I hear underneath that debate is an aspiration for unity. Certainly the yes camp wants a unified Scotland, and I think the no camp does too. They want unity among the people, and they want unity also with the other people who live on the same island. And so to me, the question is, how is Scotland going to go for that common interest in staying together as a society? So there's going to be a huge dialogue, or I would hope a dialogue. In other words, after the debate comes the dialogue. Sometimes, you know, we would wish in negotiation that the dialogue precedes the debate, but in this case, there's going to be a dialogue after the debate. And the question will be, how do we come together? And then there's going to be very much that very important conversation too with your neighbors to the south, of how do you come together in a good way? Because if you employ adversarial methods in either situation, either within Scotland or within the British Isles, you can almost invariably predict that there will be a lose-lose outcome. Everyone will lose from that, economically, politically, socially, culturally. And so, to me, that's the key challenge, is how do we shift the dynamic from an adversarial mode to a collaborative mode?
So you've watched the debates, or a debate. You've seen that we're not starting with a clean sheet of paper on the 19th of September. We're starting with what has at least been in part quite an adversarial form of debate, which has led to certain of the protagonists being quite angry with each other, and certain groups being angry with other groups. So that's part of the starting point. It is by no means the only picture, and we're very aware here that that is probably a minority, and there's been a huge amount of rich and engaged conversation. But you mentioned debate and you mentioned dialogue, and it's this journey from debate to dialogue which is of interest. So on the 19th of September, there is that backdrop of at least some polarization, some antagonism, and some debate. How do we move, or can we move quickly, and how do we move sufficiently quickly into something which is genuinely based upon an appreciation of mutual interest, mutual gain, and recognition of the other. And what I want to really drill down on here, William, are the specific tools, techniques, attitudes that people will need to adopt to achieve the kind of multi or mutually beneficial outcome which, correctly, I think you observe we really need to try to aspire to.
Well, good. Yeah, I think it all starts with one thing, and that's listening. Negotiation we often think of as talking, and when in the newspapers when you talk about negotiations, they talk about talks. There'll be talks between Westminster and Hollywood. There'll be talks here, but actually, what we need, there are talk shows on the radio and on television. But what we need is listen shows. And we need more listening, because actually effective negotiation is much more about listening than it is about talking. Because by listening, what can you do? You engage in the act of empathy, of trying to understand the other side's point of view. Not just the rhetorical points they're making, but what's underneath that. What are the real yearnings of the Scottish people, of people? What are they yearning for? Is it unity? Is it economic well-being? Is it a sense of, a distinct culture? Is it political, being able to have say over political decisions that affect you, whether it's the National Health Service or welfare or the deployment of tridents, whatever it is, you want to have say. And so, to me, once you look behind the positions, because so far it's very much in terms of positions, it's in terms of independence or not independence, but to look behind what people are tangibly demanding, for what is it that they're really desiring? What are the underlying needs or desires or concerns or fears or aspirations that people have? Once you move the spotlight from positions onto interests through a process of listening, then I think what you begin to see is that actually there's a lot more common ground than you imagine. And then there can begin a process of creativity, of saying, what are some ways in which we can meet the interests of the people of Scotland, and in conjunction with the peoples of who are your neighbors? And to me, the question is, it's even though the yes/no is a yes, kind of, it seems like a binary dual thing. In the end, what you're talking about lies on a continuum, and the question is, where on the point of the continuum from a unitary state to two independent states living in interdependence with each other does Scotland want to be?
And just, again, exploring that a bit further, some of the positioning or the positions that have been taken in a fairly solid fashion around, for example, currency and defense, the place of nuclear weapons and so forth. And there may be a sense of asymmetry in that it may be felt that for a number of political, geographical, social and other reasons, the negotiations are not necessarily between two parties who are in parity, as it were. And there's a particular situation where the UK is going to a general election in May 2015, so that adds a bit of political frisson to the period during which negotiations might take place. So again, what advice do you have where you have people, possibly, well, inevitably on both sides, who have taken up strong positions on particular policy issues, who may find it difficult to depart from these for political and electoral reasons in the period of time during which negotiations should take place? I hear what you're saying, general principle about the identification of interest. So can we again drill down on some of the specific techniques, skills, and other strategies that negotiators might take?
Well, I think one thing is to look at who are the players in this negotiation. Because if you just take, the Scottish government and the UK government, that's one player. But to me, ultimately, we need to widen that circle. And to me, one of the great benefits of the referendum is that it's activated, it's engaged, it's energized the population, so that people who are talking about it at the breakfast table, on the buses or wherever. So people are engaged, and so to me, I would want to take that wave of interest and concern and energy and channel it, find institutional ways, find creative mechanisms to channel it into a force that can encourage the political leaders to do the right thing. And just one example that comes to mind, since we were just talking about South Africa. For example, it wasn't just negotiations between Mandela and de Klerk that settled that. In fact, Mandela and de Klerk didn't have the best personal chemistry. So what happened was the entire society got involved. So that there became, in fact, there was a mechanism called the National Peace Accord, which took the form of a National Peace Committee of people from all sectors of South African society, all races, all groups, and so on. But there was one nationally, but there was one for each part of South Africa, each region of South Africa, all the way down to the neighborhood level. So you had these conversations going between people of all different trades, all different classes, all different things, where they actually engaged in conversations about how was South Africa going to make this transition in a peaceful way rather than a violent way. And they worked with the local police to try to deal with, to try to prevent things from getting out of hand, because there was quite a bit of violence in the transition. But I'm wondering whether, you know, for Scotland, whether you couldn't look for some way, some mechanism to engage Scottish society, the business sector, the labor sector, the women's sector, the NGO sector, the religious sector, engaging civil society in a broad, using the media and social media, having a broad-based conversation about what kind of Scotland do we want, using interest-based dialogue, using listening, and creating an environment in which it will be much easier for political leaders to find face-saving ways of backing out of entrenched positions, looking for a solution that actually will serve the benefit of everyone.
Let's pick up on that, face-saving ways to move forward, because there may be not just a perception, but the reality that some people have positioned themselves in corners where it's going to be very difficult for them to move without feeling a loss of face. And in the political world, that, of course, is magnified because of the media and other dynamics. And there are others in the background, constituencies, literally constituencies, as well as nominal constituencies, to whom these people have to play and whose support, vocal and electoral, they depend upon. So what can a negotiator, let's think about the Scotland and the rest of UK negotiation, assuming a yes vote, although there are going to be negotiations anyway about the increase in powers, we are told, even if there's a no vote. What can negotiators do to help folks who are on apparently the other side, who've so positioned themselves and have constituencies outside the negotiation circle that they need help?
Well, this is the thing. I think from a negotiation point of view, you take that problem and first of all, you look and see who those constituencies are and make sure that you map out who are the key constituencies that these leaders respond to. And you would want to engage leaders of those constituencies in conversations with each other, so that you'd have a kind of a dialogue or negotiation among them, maybe business constituencies, political constituencies, other kinds of constituencies. But I think one very useful exercise to begin the process is you actually begin the process by imagining the end, and you work backwards. And in this case, what you could do, I find a very useful, simple exercise to do, is to write out in advance the victory speeches of both Alex Salmond and David Cameron, or whoever the leaders should be. Write out the speeches that they would give in which they would announce a joint agreement for how Scotland and the United Kingdom are going to coexist and live well together for mutual benefit. Write out those two speeches that they would each give, addressing. Think about what they could say in those speeches that would, for the Scottish nationalists, would give the sense that, yes, we've advanced. We're strategically advancing our long-term historic aspirations. And same time, for David Cameron to be able to say, yes, we've done well. We've advanced the interests of the British Isles and the United Kingdom, or whatever it is, and then work backwards and say, okay, what kind of agreement could actually meet the test of them being able to give those victory speeches? And So I think you want to work back from imagining a success, doing that thought experiment, work backwards, and then say, okay, what kind of process do we need to arrive at that document that they could each give their victory speeches for?
Very helpful. Let's assume that on one side there is no understanding of the principle of getting to yes, there's apparent intransigence, stonewalling, and an unwillingness to negotiate at all or to depart from certain fixed positions. Now, that's not like in this room we are surrounded by people who, in their professional and other lives, are negotiating in commercial, business, organizational matters day in, day out, and we are not unfamiliar with these situations where the asymmetry is a skill deficit, if you like, viewed from our perspective on one side. What again are the specific tools, apart from listening, that we can use with those who appear not to have the ability or competence to engage with us in interest-based negotiation?
Well, one is, I'm sure, a tool that you in particular and everyone in the room, I'm sure, is familiar with, is the use of third parties, is the use of facilitators. Let's not even call them mediators, but just a facilitated conversation. When people are in entrenched positions, when there are deep emotions involved, when they find it difficult to communicate, when they find it difficult to listen, then the use of third-siders, of people who may even be on one side or the other, but actually are open to this kind of getting to yes, collaborative kind of process, they can actually make progress. And just give you an example, for example, we were talking about South Africa, but in South Africa, you had a very poor personal chemistry between Mandela and de Klerk. They didn't trust each other, they didn't really like each other so much. They didn't communicate so well with each other. So one level down in their governments, you had two gentlemen who were, one was a union leader, a trade union leader, Cyril Ramaphosa, working for the ANC, but had a lot of experience negotiating with companies. So he knew about negotiation. And then there was a junior minister in de Klerk's government whose name was Rolf Meyer. And the two of them formed a relationship, a very interesting relationship. They were brought together by a third-sider who was a Johannesburg businessman who thought these two should know each other early on in the process. He invited them and their families out to his country place for the weekend. Said there was some fishing, and when Rolf Meyer arrived with his family and Cyril Ramaphosa arrived with his family, Rolf arrived in kind of a helicopter, a government helicopter, and their host said, well, very unfortunately, this was not planned, but his daughter just injured herself in a riding accident, and he needed to use a helicopter to take the daughter to the hospital. So their host disappeared, leaving these two men and their families kind of awkwardly looking at each other. And the kids said, no, we need to go, let's go fishing. You promised us to go fishing. So they went fishing, and Rolf Meyer was not a skilled fisherman, got the hook implanted in his hand very painfully, and tried to pull it out, but was unable. And so Cyril Ramaphosa said, well, my wife's a nurse, and she came and she tried to extract it, but again was not able to extract it. And so finally, Cyril said to Rolf, he said, well, I've always wanted to hurt you, Nats, but not quite like this. And he yanked the hook out of the hand. But in any case, out of that incident and out of that weekend, the two men formed a friendship, and they were able to get together. Even when talks had formally broken down, the rhetoric had gotten high, there was violence on the streets, these two would get together and they would work out, okay, what's the next move in the process? How can we move this forward? What can we do? So behind the scenes, these two were almost acting a little bit like co-mediators. They were negotiators, but they were trying to mediate a way out of this, mediate a way through the process. And to me, you want to look for those, I call that, that particular negotiation method, I call those people the wizards. And the reason I do is many years ago, I was in Geneva with Roger Fisher, actually, and we were talking with the US and the Soviet arms control negotiators back in the old ages of the Cold War. And we asked them, why aren't you making any progress? It's been 7 years since there's been any arms control treaty, and before that there was a whole bunch of them. And they said, oh, well, back then, there were many reasons, but back then we had the wizards. I said, what were the wizards? And they said the wizards were 2 Russians and 2 Americans who had 4 characteristics. They were bilingual in English and Russian. They were technically knowledgeable about the subject, which happened to be arms control. They were lower level than the ambassador, and hence, as they joked, they were disposable. And whenever there was an impasse in the talks, these 4 would get together out on the ferry boat in the lake or at a nice restaurant, and they would kind of just brainstorm. What if we were to count the warheads this way? What if we were to do it that way? Each side knowing full well that neither had the authority to commit their respective sides. And the joke about being disposable was if they went too far, you could always ship them back to Washington or Moscow and say it was all a problem. And so more creative ideas, they said, for breaking through impasses came out of those wizard conversations than out of any other source. So my question for Scotland today is, where are the wizards?
Well, it's a question we might ask ourselves when we go offline. Let me develop that, because that seems to be based fundamentally on relationships. And I know that some of the relationships, again, perhaps inevitably, have become strained, at least at this stage in the journey. And there will be tensions about the sharing of ideas and about the engaging with the other in the immediate aftermath of what's been a difficult and complicated time. What are your thoughts about how wizards and others go about creating relationships and re-engaging with people with whom they really do need to get on in the way that you describe these 2 gentlemen got on, in order to help to promote effective negotiation?
Well, I think it's, it's the basic, I think for people to, I think one thing I think that could be helpful is for everyone who's on the yes side to reach out to someone who's on the no side, or everyone's on the no side to reach out to someone on the yes side, and just invite them for a coffee or a drink or something, just to begin that conversation of weaving the fabric of Scottish society back together. And out of those conversations, which could take place, in places of work, you could be a workmate, it could be a family member, it could be whatever. Out of those conversations, I think you begin to build those relationships. I mean, I saw that happen in Northern Ireland, for example, over many and many decades, which is people started to reach out. A Catholic priest started to reach out to a Protestant minister. It started actually with women. Women who were the mothers of victims started to reach out to each other. They had the courage, actually, courage that their politicians didn't have, to actually reach out across the chasm, which was a much bigger chasm, I would say, than exists in Scotland. But they reached out. They then created space for religious leaders to reach out, and then for business leaders to say, hey, this makes no sense. This is not good for business. And in fact, I would think that the business sector in Scotland ought to be very keenly interested in, no matter how the vote goes, that this be in a way that maintains Scotland as a place which is competitive in the global market. So you have so many. The thing is, what happens is when you have a process like this yes/no vote, you brought out that, what you mentioned, that active minority on each side, so that almost, if you're a spectator from outside, you think all of Scotland is polarized. But in fact, it may be 10% of the population on each side. I don't know what the percentage is. Now's the time for the third side, the middle, the center, for a coalition, to build a winning coalition of people of solid sense who can reach out, who have relationships with the extremes, but can reach out and say, what makes good sense for Scotland right now, for the whole? Speak for the community.
And is that a suggestion of something that should be done even prior to September the 18th? It seems clear that afterwards, the extending of the hand of friendship, whether it be through joy or regret, is going to be very, very important. But even now?
Well, now, for example, to me, there could be an interesting question right now. Since no one knows who's going to win, is you could say, you could have people on the yes side and the no side come together for an interesting conversation saying, okay, let's agree on some rules of the game. We'll agree that whoever wins, will engage in this. Since you don't know who's going to win, you're going to you have a strong incentive to make sure that that it's neutral. That it's going to be good for the whole. So you could actually have an interesting conversation now about what happens on September 19th. That whoever wins will show generosity. Will show. Will reach out to the other side. One of the things is there's a lot of emotion involved in this and feelings, as you mentioned. And so one of the dimensions that needs to be dealt with is how do you deal with those feelings? How are you going to deal with the feelings of those who are going to be jubilant and those who are going to be depressed? And how do you manage those feelings in a way that allows for Scotland to come together? Asking the question, how can Scotland come together after a polarizing vote like this and a polarizing debate? That's a good question.
Yeah, it's a question that we've been thinking about today as we look forward. What are the roles and the opportunities on September the 19th? And I'm really interested, I think, to explore just a little bit more this idea of the third side, because you mentioned that in the context of facilitators and mediators in perhaps the conventional sense, one or two individuals working with one or two other or groups of negotiators, but very powerfully, and you're hinting at this, there is the third side, which is the community. And in your book, The Third Side, you explore the anthropological and historical journey that the human species has been on in terms of utilization of the third side. I mean, this is a great moment, isn't it, for Scotland to somehow cultivate and engage with that whole idea and concept of third side. So it might be helpful for us here for you just to explore a little bit more the history, the anthropology, and the journey which leads you to the conclusion that third sides in general are so important.
John, I think to me, what I call the third side is really the most ancient human heritage that we have for dealing with conflict. Because, we evolved, as we know, as hunters and gatherers. That was maybe 99% of our history. And I had a chance just to visit and spend some time with some groups of hunters and gatherers, like the Bushmen or the San in South Africa or Namibia or Botswana, and observe the way in which they because they have a real dilemma, which is that all the hunters, the men, have these poison arrows, which they make a poison from the beetle dung to hunt, but it's also absolutely fatal to human beings. And if someone gets angry, all they have to take is their little arrow, and it's like an injection, and the person will die within a couple of days. But they'll have long enough to have revenge. And then you suddenly have 1, 2, 3, 4 people dead. And in a small group of, they often lived in small groups of like 30, in larger communities of 500. In a small group of 30, you lose 2 or 3 men, you've lost like half of your hunting capacity as a group. So, faced with that, a little bit like everyone having a nuclear weapon, on a larger scale. So how do they solve that dilemma? Well, what they do is they regard conflict not just as a conflict that belongs to the two parties, but it's a community responsibility. And so when people sense anger arising and conflict arising between two individuals or even between two groups, people immediately start paying attention, and someone goes and hides the poison arrows out in the desert, just so that, okay, let's at least get the weapons away from here. And then they, the friends, the neighbors, the families, the relatives, or whatever, they all kind of bring the parties together, and they all sit around in a big circle around the campfire, and they'll talk and they'll listen to each other, and it might take 2 or 3 days on end. But they just, until they get to the bottom of the issue, but everyone listens and everyone gets their say, and the whole community gets engaged, and they don't rest until there's either some kind of relational, not just a settlement, but a relational forgiveness, or, kind of back into normal relationship. If emotions are still too strong, they'll ask one of them to go visit some relatives for a few months and then come back. So there's a cooling off period. They have a whole system, and that engagement of the society in preventing conflict from arising in resolving conflict that arises and in containing conflict before it turns violent, I call it the third side. And the third side is more than just professional neutral third parties. It's everyone, because you could be close to one side, but if you're looking, the third side is the will of the community for a peaceful, beneficial resolution to the conflict. And so to me, in Scotland today is to look and say, how do we mobilize the third side? The third side is there. It's in many ways often latent, but that will, that common ground, that desire for the community to benefit, for what about the future? What about our children? What kind of society will they inherit? To mobilize that so that you could have someone who might be very close to Alex Salmond, who's a third sider. You know, I mean, Mandela in many ways was a third side leader. He was the leader of one side, but if you look at his speeches, you look at his actions, he was always standing for the whole. He was standing for the whole community. He was saying, I'm not just the leader of the Black nationalists. I aspire to be the leader of everyone. I want to have my leadership govern that. So you want to look for leaders like that, whether they're in politics, whether they're in work, in business, or whether they're in religion, or wherever they are. Those third side leaders exist who can remind people of what really matters in the long term for the community.
There are many of them in this room today, I suspect, William, and what that does is gives us a real incentive, I think, to continue to build on that third side. I want to ask about a couple of specific concepts around negotiation, and I want to broaden it out, if I may, to the Middle East before opening it up to folks in the room for questions that they may have of you. I wanted to talk about balconies and precipices, because I want to go back into the negotiation techniques and how you deal with impasse and deadlock. And there's no doubt that in negotiations which will materialize, whether or not there's a yes or a no vote, there will be some very difficult moments, and there will be apparent impasse and apparent deadlock. And you talk about the precipice, and you talk about the balcony and related concepts. Can you just expand that a little bit here for us in this room?
Well, yeah, I mean, the interesting thing, John, is that my many decades of being involved in negotiations, the thing that I've noticed is that the single biggest obstacle to us getting what we want in a negotiation is not what we usually think it is. It's not just the difficult person on the other side. It's not just the difficult party on the other side. The single biggest obstacle is right here. It's ourselves. It's in our own human, very natural, very understandable tendency to react, to act without thinking. You know, as the saying goes, when angry, you will make the best speech you will ever regret. And I think that happens more often than not. And so, to me, the foundation of successful negotiation is the ability to pull back from the precipice, you know, where, you know, the chasm in which we go into a lose-lose battle, and go to the balcony instead, which is, the balcony is like a metaphor, simply like, as if we're negotiating on a stage. Part of our mind goes to a mental and emotional place of calm, of clarity, of perspective, where we can keep our eyes on what's truly important, keep our eyes on the prize. And the ability to go to the balcony, to take a time out, to have a cooling off period when emotions get too high, the ability to just observe our own natural reactions without acting them out, the ability to control our own negative emotions, to me is fundamental. It's the foundation of successful negotiation. So that, for example, you could take that institutionally and say, where are the balconies for Scotland in this negotiation? You know, maybe Collaborative Scotland is a balcony. Right now, we are on the balcony collectively. We're looking with some perspective at this interesting conflict process going on in Scotland. You know, we're a little bit removed from the stage at this point, and we're looking to see what useful or constructive interventions might be that could help guide the process in a constructive way. So, you know, human beings can serve as balconies. You know, I noticed, for example, I've trained like hostage negotiators. They never negotiate alone. They always, you know, for example, in New York City, you know, the hostage squad, there's one person negotiating, there's 7 people on the balcony thinking, you know, what are we missing out? What should we be thinking? Should we be contacting that person's girlfriend or father or mother to try and influence them? You know, you have people on the balcony as well as people literally engage in the act of talking back and forth.
broaden it out before opening out here. One of the ventures in which you've been involved over the past several years is the Abraham Path Initiative. And we're very conscious here that we're very fortunate, and I think you mentioned this as well. We're not in Gaza, we're not in Syria, we're not in these countries where conflict has become so painful and so destructive of life. You've, I know, had a lot of involvement in the Middle East. And what I'd like to ask you about is not so much that, what I'm sure we'd all like to hear about what's really going on, but the Abraham Path Initiative and the way that symbolizes a way to bring folk together under a common theme and on a common journey, which is physical as well as metaphorical.
Right. The Abraham Path is, as you know, or maybe some know, it's a long-distance walking trail across the Middle East that retraces the footsteps of Abraham and his family, and a little bit like the Santiago de Compostela in Europe, in Spain, and France, and so on. And the idea is to ask this question, where's the third side of the Middle East? Where's the reminder of the community? And there's, we all know that human beings were very driven by stories. So, the story of Abraham reminds people that, hey, we may be fighting each other, but there's one common origin here, where there's one common family. And the message of Abraham, interestingly, what he's known for in all the different faiths and cultures is he's known most of all for hospitality, which is kindness towards strangers, which is exactly the lesson, I think, not only in the Middle East, but in the world, in a globalized world of strangers, we need to learn most. To me, I sometimes, think about, what's the future of the Middle East? Right now there's a perception, particularly in the media, that, the future of the Middle East is terrorism. What's the opposite of terrorism? Terrorism is killing innocent people in order to create fear. To me, the opposite of that is to welcome someone into your home in order to create friendship, which is hospitality. So to me, the alternative to terrorism is tourism. And the path to me is a third side. It's a third side symbol, taking the third side symbol of the story of Abraham to create a kind of a balcony, really, where people can walk. You stay in people's homes. You get to know the other side, and you bring understanding. It also brings prosperity and socioeconomic development to places that are the most marginalized communities in the Middle East. And above all, I think what as one Palestinian villager once told a journalist from, I believe it was from The Guardian, said, "What is this about?" He said, "It's about hope. Really, this path connects us with the rest of the world." So the path is now, people, when we study the idea of the path, people said, "This is impossible. No one's going to travel the Abraham path," but in fact, it exists. It's alive in 4 different countries in the Middle East. It's by the end of this year, it'll have 1,000 kilometers. It'll be as long as Santiago de Compostela. There are places that are safe to walk, really, even in these terrible circumstances. So it's to me, there's a question, which is the same question I think in some ways that's facing Scotland: is, are we going to choose a world in which everyone can benefit through collaboration, or are we going to choose the win-lose path of going to war or having adversarial fights? And to me, the Abraham path is a way of carrying that vision of a world in which everyone can benefit, because the travelers benefit enormously, the villagers benefit enormously, and the world benefits from having this symbol of hope.
There are 2 words there which resonate, I hope, with us in Scotland, and these words are hope and hospitality. I think that we are known for our hospitality. It may well be that we should be extending that more to ourselves and to others across whatever boundaries and borders we perceive exist before and perhaps after September 18. But that word hope is very important as well. It's come up already today as we look forward with hope to whatever the future might hold. William, I'm going to pause for a second. I'm going to invite questions from our audience. The cameraman, I think, will expand the field of vision so that you can see a bit further. We haven't choreographed this in advance. At the moment, I'm facing a camera with my back to the audience. So what I'm now going to do is to turn around and elicit questions from the audience if I can. It may mean that you and I will not be in direct visual contact for periods of time, but I think we can cope.
Sure.
Excellent. So I'll get up and I'll see what happens. Are you still there? Ah, you're still there. Right. So, Robin, we're going to bring a mic down, and the camera is now. This is Robin Burley. Welcome and introduce you to William Ury. Robin.
Thank you for the opportunity to ask you a question. That was fascinating. I was enthralled all the way through. I chair the Scottish Mediation Network, and one of the things that we've done over the years is to promote peer mediation within schools. And I want to ask you a sort of slightly loaded question, I suppose, in relation to that. And that is that when we had our discussions earlier today, we were looking at the gladiatorial sort of activity that has been going on, which you referred to in the debate. And we were sort of thinking, well, how do you get away from that? I rather suspect that we can only do it over time because it's about culture change, and that, well, the gladiators might have been people that were fighting each other before, and now they're fighting each other with words, and in the future we are going to find a new way of maybe having dialogue as the way that people will deal with their differences. How, in your experience, have we looked to help the younger generation to become more adept at dialogue? And do you have any models of where we might look in Scotland to help the future generations? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I think you've put your finger on it, Robin. I think long-term hope lies with, a change in mindset, really, and a change in, and that is a generational change. But it only takes one generation, and it can actually happen faster than we think. And I do think it begins with kids and children, because children in my experience, take to these methods very easily, and it becomes common sense. Peer mediation, or having mediators in playgrounds, who help break up fights or stop bullying, and have to deal with these kinds of issues that exist in elementary schools, in high schools, and so on. So I think, and there are literally thousands of experiments, at least across the United States, and I'm sure across the world, in various ways of introducing mediation, negotiation, collaborative problem-solving techniques into the curriculum. It doesn't even just have to be peer mediation. It could be even just ways. I've seen interesting programs where they use it as a prism to teach history, through the prism of, okay, what lessons are we learning, for example, in history around what are the effects of win-lose adversarial methods? In some sense, in a larger sense, you look at history. We're right now at the 100th anniversary of World War I, in which many Scots lost their lives, and that was an example where people thought, we're going to win. The boys will be back by Christmas in 1914. And in September 1914, they thought, okay, just be a few months, a little battle. And in fact, everyone lost, and it was a huge cost, and it set the seeds for World War II. So, to me, teaching history through the lens of looking at what are the costs of different ways of handling conflict, that can also work. It also can be taught even through math and through social studies, and so there's so many ways in which it can be integrated into the curriculum. I also think that to link together peer mediation right now, there's a new wave of curricula being developed around social emotional intelligence, and obviously the skills of social emotional intelligence, which are now they're systematic studies, widespread studies that have been carried out, that actually social emotional skills and competencies actually have more to do with a person's later success in life than the things that we always thought were the keys, around math and reading and so on, that actually those skills are just as important, in fact, probably more determinative of a child's future success. And tying those into teaching mediation, which are, skills of empathy, for example, as an example. So to me, this is a rich opportunity where we're just, this field of mediation, I believe, is still in its infancy. And there's so much room for innovation, for learning, for seeing what works and then taking it to scale in order to accomplish that kind of generational education that I think ultimately will be necessary if this world is going to come to a better end. Because to me, right now, just on a very large scale, going back to a question that John was asking me earlier, one of the things that motivated me to come into the field of mediation negotiation was having grown up in the Cold War. And I could never understand why it is that we were prepared to actually put the entire human experiment, put all of humanity at risk for a conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. That there must be a better way. And to me, we're engaged in a race right now between our technological genius at devising weapons of destruction and our social genius, our social moral genius at devising ways in which human beings can live with each other and deal with their differences short of violence. And to me, education with children is a key part of winning that race.
Great question, even greater answer. Let's do something else. Another question. Jock Steen. Jock, do you want to stand up just so that we're sure who you are and you could be clearly heard?
Thank you. In any negotiation, the media tend to have a large role. How can ways be found to ensure that in a period of negotiation, the media can, if you like, emphasize collaboration instead of picking up any stories of conflict, which tends to happen?
Yeah, I've noticed that in almost every conflict situation I've been in, at least political conflict, is the media often inadvertently fans the flames of conflict because it's what grabs a headline is so-and-so attacked so-and-so, and they often, sometimes the journalist goes to one side and says, what do you think of so-and-so? And then they go back to the other side, did you hear what that person said? How would you respond? And, it can definitely, since media companies are competing for headlines and attention, conflict is a great way of grabbing it. So to me, what's required actually is, or what's useful is, first of all, is media training. Training for the media in conflict, but offering, for example, so that reporters and editors and so on can maybe learn a little bit about, okay, how do you report? How can you constructively report on a conflict in a way that meets your interests in getting attention, and at the same time maybe serves the larger societal interest. So I myself have trained journalists at different times, and I've seen others as well. So that's a whole nother field to develop. Then there's the media training for mediators and third-siders about how best to make use of the media in a way that frames it, because so much of it is about how you frame an issue. Right now, the framing, for example, of the debate in Scotland is very much adversarial, win, lose, yes or no. But to be able to, for example, frame the choice, the real choice that the Scottish people will face, which is between dealing with these issues in an adversarial way that will likely lead to everyone losing, the United Kingdom losing, Scotland losing, everyone losing, or dealing with it in a way that can work for mutual benefit. If that's the real choice, is to get that kind of message out in the media to say, what's really going on here? What's the real story? To be able to give people a sense of that is key. And I think one of the challenges, as I've talked to the media, is just in terms of they don't quite understand the process of negotiation or the process of mediation. There's often, all they can understand is they're very much focused on the outcome. Is there an agreement or is there no agreement? But for us to give them a vocabulary to understand the process so they can tell whether the process is going in a constructive direction or in a destructive direction, I think that can be very helpful.
Yes, Alison. Alison Edmondson.
Hello. You're probably aware there's been debate going on in lots of different community spaces. My experience is that the main medium by which most of my friends have communicated about the referendum has been on Facebook, which obviously has its advantages and its disadvantages. And I wanted to pose you a hypothetical question, if I can ask you to put yourself in my shoes. I'm thinking ahead to what I might post at 10 p.m. on the 18th of September when the polls close. I haven't contributed at all to the debate on Facebook among my friends, and my feeling is that's the moment when I actually want to have my tuppence worth. But I suppose I'd be really interested to hear if you were drafting a sentence or two to be seen by 200 only of your community at that point in our nation's history, what would you say?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is the question, how can we come together now? To frame it as an open-ended question and saying, okay, the verdict is in. How can we come together now, to make a better Scotland? And just posing that as a question and seeing what ideas people come up with. It might be, because looking for practical ways in which Scotland can, after engaging in a somewhat polarizing process, can begin to mend the fabric and look forward. How can we come together now?
As a question rather than an assertion. Other questions? Richard, and then Angus. Richard Fraser, Minister of Greyfriars Kirk, which I don't think you visited when you were here, but who is hosting our midnight vigil this evening. Richard.
Hi there. Yes. The question I've got is really around the issue of better together is the slogan for the No campaign. But I have a hunch that better together is actually Alex Salmond's wish. We want to keep the monarchy, we want to keep the pound, and we want to keep the social union between Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom. The problem, I think, is that what people are actually saying, I think, in the Yes campaign is, we want to maintain a relationship with the rest of the United Kingdom, but we want to be better together. So the question is, how do you address that kind of issue to a Prime Minister who says, if you vote no, if you vote yes, this is a divorce, and you cannot expect any of the marriage to continue?
Yeah, well, the thing is, I think first of all, we have to take with a heavy grain of salt threats or implied threats or veiled threats that are being made in order to influence the decision of voters. I think it will look different on the other side, because the truth is, once the dust settles for a moment, you're the same island, you're the same society. It's not like you're going to see border posts show up. I don't think between Scotland and England. So I think what will be really important is for people like the Prime Minister or the First Minister to hear words like yours. I mean, I thought that's a very interesting way of reframing, which is to take the words of the other side, one side, the no side, and say, actually, that's actually a common interest between both sides, is better together. Because the real question is, it looks binary, but there's a continuum. It's not just I know that you talked about the federal solution. Maybe you had a discussion of that earlier in the day, and I remember sitting in, conflict situations or whatever, where, there's probably 100 different possibilities. It's not like there's one federal solution, but there are 100 different possibilities of ways in which you can share power, share responsibilities, have a multi-centric political system where Edinburgh is in charge of certain things, London maybe has certain things, Brussels has others, but essential sovereignty resides in the people themselves. So there's so much potential for innovation there if you can have a creative conversation around what does it mean practically to be better together. And one other thing I'll say is that this goes back to the third side is just remembering this, an incident from Northern Ireland, for example. At one moment, there was a ceasefire, an IRA ceasefire, and it was broken by the IRA. And I have this on good account from a friend. There was a family dinner conversation between Martin McGuinness, his wife, and his daughter, and they said, "You promised us that there would be a ceasefire." In other words, there was a family conversation taking place. And so to me, what's really important is that the leaders on both sides who may have gotten very far out in saying, we want divorce and so on, that they're pulled back by people whom they trust, who are close to them, who say, hey, time to go to the balcony, time to remember what's really good for the UK. I mean, a divorce is not good for the UK. It's not, in other words, a bitter divorce like that, because you're wedded together. I remember, during the Irish Troubles, I remember going to Belfast at one point, and visiting the wall there that divides that city between Catholic and Protestant neighborhoods, and just that huge wall, kind of ugly and so on, and you see it, and then. So what I was saying was we crossed into the Republic of Ireland, and there's no border. There's even no border post. So things have shifted in Europe. So it's the real question is going to be it's not just independence or not, but how are we going to be interdependent? In what form are we going to be interdependent? Because the interdependence, economic, cultural, political, social, is there. That fabric is there. And it would be hugely destructive to all to try to break that fabric. It's just a question of what is the best arrangement to allow those natural relationships to take place and to allow people to participate in the way in which they choose.
I wish we could have the maturity of that third side view just seeping through all of our conversations for the next couple of weeks, but at least those of us who are here and who will view this later have the privilege of hearing this. Now, Angus, I think you had a question. We'll maybe take one more after that, if there's anybody else who's interested in asking. This is Angus Skinner. William, you can't see him, but you can hear him. Speak.
Yep, good, okay. I didn't study much anthropology, and I did study some sociology many decades ago. And my memory from that is that the easiest and strongest way to get a group pulling together is to have a clear and shared goal, and often a clear and shared enemy. Now, both sides of the Scottish debate have actually decades of history of falling out internally amongst themselves, and our coalitions is probably not quite the right word in this context, but there are many different interests really on both sides. So I wonder from your experience whether at these points of decision making there's a danger of the two sides internally beginning to splinter because they no longer have necessarily a common enemy, and possibly in some cases not necessarily a common cause. And do you have any advice to give? Have you seen that anywhere else? And do you have any advice to give from that rich and fascinating experience you've described?
So if I understand your question is, do you see internal dissension on both sides that happens as a result of a conflict like this? I do see that happen. And my guess is there's going to be if you did a map of the different stakeholders and players in this conflict, you would see that in fact it's not just one side and the other, but there are many different possibilities here. And so I think that that gives actually some opportunities too, because if, for example, there's some splintering that takes place in the Scottish, National Party, for example, it could offer some possibilities for third side, or so this is a multi-party, many-party situation, and I would say too that I was going back to some other part of your question, just trying to remember what it was. It was around. No, you had the question
that might happen.
I'm sorry.
There's an internal fragmentation that might happen with the loss of a common cause and the loss of a common enemy.
And yeah, exactly. That's what I want to come back to. Is I think one of the great challenges, and this is something again, an opportunity for reframing by the third side, is to articulate the common cause that exists and to stand for that common cause. And that common cause, in its most evident and general form, is the well-being of Scotland, and you could focus it on what's the future of the children of the next generation of Scotland. To ask a question like, what kind of society do you want your children to grow up in? What kind of society do you want your grandchildren to grow up in? Oftentimes, if you can put that question out, that actually brings people together often, because you find that if you just look a little bit into the future instead of right now in the present where it seems so polarized, but look together in the future, you'll find a lot of common ground. And that's where the third side can play that role of reminding people of the whole, of the community, of the future, of the children.
Okay, one more. We got any more questions? One more from Graham.
Hi there. I think we have a bit of experience in Scotland of being able to come together to identify common stuff, which led to the original devolution settlement happening when we had a constitutional convention. And I wonder whether there's yes or whether there's no, whether something like that may have a role to play to bring people together. Because if it's no, then there's going to be a need to sort out something that's different from what we have now. And it's going to need to encompass all Scotland's civic society. And if it's yes, I don't think the singular vision that's in the bill which we're voting on just now is actually necessarily something that's come from a wider agreement in Scotland, and might be a way then of pulling people in who are on the no side, but then can see a way of influencing what the future of the Scottish Parliament, Constitution, whatever you want, but what our future is going to be. Is that something you've seen happen in other places?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent idea to consider, because I'm reminded right now I'm sitting here at the University of Colorado, and long ago there was a dean of peace studies, who was a very famous British, he might even be Scottish, I don't know, economist whom I knew, whose name was Kenneth Boulding. He was a really giant in the field of economics and in the field of peace studies, and he used to like to say, when people were doubting, the possibility of peace or whatever, he would say, if it exists, it's possible. And what he meant by that, if it's already taken place once, it could take place again. Or if you could see, peace breaking out in Europe after 2 world wars, why can't you see peace breaking out in the Middle East? Or if it can happen in South Africa, why can't it happen here? And to really get people to see what might be possible. And so you're saying, it worked before. So it doesn't mean that you have to just take the exact same thing and have it do it again, but you can learn from it, you can adapt, you can figure out an innovation for doing it again. But precisely that kind of conversation to me would be very useful, because if I look at it just from a negotiation point of view, if I'm in the yes camp, plan B, what's plan B? What's my bat now? If I lose this vote, I'm not going to give up. I'm going to try to continue to pursue those interests, getting greater devolution, maybe planning another vote at some point in the future. This issue isn't going to go away. once the vote takes place on September 18th. It's existed in Scottish society for many decades now, if not longer. And the same thing is true for the people who might vote no. What's Plan B? Plan B is clearly a sizable proportion of the Scottish electorate has said, we want a different constitutional setup. We want more devolution of powers. So I would want to move in that direction too, because if only to head off another vote, 5 years or 10 years from now. So to me, there's a lot of common ground in using this as an opportunity and saying this is a real opportunity for Scotland to have a conversation about what are the right constitutional governance arrangements, what are all the creative possibilities in which we can relate to our neighbors to the south.
William, we can see you again. I can see you again. I'm going to begin to wind this up now, and I'll come back to reflections and thanks shortly, but a couple of questions, if I may. From Colorado, and from the States generally, how much, if any, interest is there in what's happening here, thousands of miles away across the water in Scotland and in the United Kingdom as a whole?
Well, that's a good question. Certainly, you have an ardent, interested person right here. But I think it is getting. I've seen it getting some play in the media, and I think this is the key. I think what's happening in Scotland, while it's indigenous to Scotland and it has its own particular characteristics, is part of a global process that's taking place in many parts of the world. So there are a lot of people paying attention. I know there are a lot of people paying attention in Barcelona, for example. There are a lot of people paying attention in Wales. There are a lot of probably people even paying attention in Ukraine and in different parts of the world where because right now, because of the process of globalization, there's increasing interest in our cultural roots, in our regional or our tribal identities and so on. And the question, facing us is how can we reconcile all of these things? As we globalize and become one community, how can we also celebrate our differences and celebrate our particularities? And I think, so what's happening in Scotland, I think, and particularly if with the help of you there in the room, if this can go into a constructive direction on September 19th, if it can move in a constructive direction, Scotland can show the world the possibilities of a negotiated, mediated way in which you can aim for a solution that's good for both the yes and the no camps within Scotland, for Great Britain, for Europe as a whole, and even for the world as a whole.
William, I know you're working, wonderful words, thank you for that, very encouraging. You're working, I think, on your latest book, which is due out at the beginning of, or in sometime in 2015. Remind me of its title and what's the theme?
It harkens back to our conversation about the balcony. It's called Getting to Yes with Yourself and Other Worthy Opponents.
Bring forward the publication date to about 2 weeks from now.
Yeah, it's really about, in some ways, this win-lose mindset, this adversarial mindset really has its roots within us. And if we can shift that mindset within us and turn ourselves from being often our worst opponents into our best allies, then I think we have a chance to get to a true and genuine yes.
When you were last here, you brought your wife, Lizanne, and you brought your daughter, Gabby, with you. And I know that Gabby, to whom you refer in The Power of a Positive No, with great affection in the first chapter, Gabby has achieved something pretty significant in the recent past, in something which has gone fairly viral, I think, on perhaps YouTube. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, Gabby, for those who don't know, my daughter, she just turned 16 in April, and she was born with some congenital physical challenges that required many surgeries. She had about 14 surgeries, and in January of this year, she announced that for her 16th birthday, she announced to us that she wanted to realize an old dream of hers, which is to set a Guinness World Record. She had previously done this by trying to put the most number of socks on a foot when she was 7, or the longest hopscotch course. And this time she decided she was going to take on the abdominal plank, which is a core abdominal strengthening exercise where you put your elbows down on the table and you stretch out your body and you hold it for as long as you can. I can hold it for maybe a minute or two. Most people can. And the record for women was about 40 minutes. And but she really set herself up for that. And lo and behold, if by April, she, on her birthday, at her birthday party, we had all the cameras set, to get all the evidence for Guinness, and she went for an hour and 20 minutes. She doubled the world record, and so as a teenager who was abdominally challenged because of all her surgeries, she was able to take on perhaps the world's greatest abdominal challenge and succeed. And to me, the lesson that she actually would like to convey is that, sometimes you can look at your own challenges and you can turn them into strengths. And you can overcome challenges that might seem unthinkable to you and to others. And so I think that's maybe a good inspiration for you there in Scotland, which is because I know it can seem challenging right now, of how do you turn this conversation from its adversarial turn into a collaborative turn? How do you turn it from debate into dialogue? How do you turn it from win-lose into win-win-win? So Gabi gives us a little bit of inspiration that we can take on those challenges and overcome them. So I wish you much success, really, in these next days, these next weeks, these next months. And if I can be of any further service, it would be my pleasure.
That's so kind, and just please do send our love to Gabi and to Lisanne from all of us here in Scotland. You can tell Gabi that I have got as one of my props today the Dumbledore sorting hat from Harry Potter. I seem to recall she had quite an interest in Harry Potter when she was here, and I'm sure that it continues. William, thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute privilege for us all to share this hour and a half with you. I think we've learned so much, we've shared so much, we benefit enormously from your experience and expertise. We benefit also, I think, from your gracious and humble way of sharing with us. We wish you well in all the work that you're doing, which, from the stories you've told, is probably just the topsoil of what you do. Clearly are challenging and yet really, really important opportunities. So we send our best wishes to you, but more than that, we give you our great thanks, and I extend the physical hand of a thanks and friendship and gratitude to you, even though we can't physically touch in every other way. We've been enormously privileged to have you here. Thank you for giving the time, and I'm fairly sure that there will be people here who may well accept your invitation to be further of assistance to us in the next days, weeks and months. But in the meantime, our thanks to you. We're going to give you our collective thanks in the customary fashion, and we'll say good night and very best wishes.